This is the makeup recording for confirmation lesson number 8, the Old Testament historical books. We'll start with our announcements. Our next meeting is February 11th. That's the week after the Super Bowl. We have middle school Monday right after that, the next day on February 12th. That's 7 to 8:30. And on this Friday, which is February 2nd, we have kind of an escape room type thing. It's called a breakout box. We'll have several rooms going. We want to get a competition going. We'll have pizza and snacks, and there'll be prizes for the winning team. I'm going to send out an email this week, and so please respond. Let us know if you're coming. It should be a fun night. It's like an escape room type thing like we do at Middle School Monday. All right, starting with the memory verse, it comes from Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. All right, in a review, the first 5 books of the Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We've talked about those already this year, and this week we're going to talk about the next 12 books, and they are called the historical books of the Old Testament. I'll give you a second to write all those names down. All right, the book we're looking at, or starting off with tonight, is Joshua. Joshua picks up right after Deuteronomy, and it is right after Moses has died. Joshua has taken over Moses' job and is bringing the Israelites into the Promised Land. But that land wasn't empty. Foreigners had settled on that land, and the Israelites were going to have to use force. They were going to have to fight battles and fight in wars to get this land away from the people who lived there. And of course God was on their side, and so when they trusted God, when they relied on Him and followed His plan, they won. And when they didn't, when they relied on themselves, when they used their own ideas instead of what God had told them, they lost the battles. So some key events in Joshua. Rahab hides spies. That's a very important one. Rahab is actually the first woman mentioned in the lineage of Jesus. She is credited as being an ancestor of Jesus, and she is one of only 2 women mentioned as foremothers of Jesus. And this is because she helped the nation of Israel conquer the Promised Land. Something else that's important in Joshua is that Israelites are all circumcised. That is a physical sign of following God. That's something that He had His people do. They crossed the Jordan River in a miraculous fashion, just like they crossed the Red Sea. God used a miracle to show the people His power. He had the waters dry up, and they were able to walk across. The fall of Jericho is a story many of you might remember. That's when they walked around the walled city 7 days in a row, and on the 7th day they blew their trumpets, and the walls fell down, and they conquered the city of Jericho. And then in Joshua, the 12 tribes of Israel divide up the territory. The 12 tribes go back to the 12 sons of Jacob, and those are the people that went to Egypt in the first place. So the land is divided up among the 12 tribes. Up next is Judges, and Judges refer to the people who led Israel in the time after Joshua, once they settled into the Promised Land. And this is before they had a king, so their rulers were called Judges. And you'll see here on the screen kind of the cycle of what the people of Israel went through. They were sinning. They wouldn't listen to God, and then God would let their enemies come in and conquer them. And then they would turn back to God and ask Him for help, and He would send them a leader, a judge, usually a warrior, to help them fight their way and to get back to where they should be. And God rescues them using the judge. However, the judges were not always the perfect leaders. Many of the stories revolve judges who are flawed, who don't always listen to God. And so it reminds us that we need a true Savior, a perfect Savior, not a human. And so we know there were at least 12 judges. The 3 important ones were Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. And as I said, they get progressively worse. They are not always the perfect leaders for the nation of Israel. All right, the next book is Ruth. It is the story of love and redemption. Boaz is an Israelite man that marries Ruth, and he kind of saves the family of Ruth. Ruth had been a non-Israelite woman, and her husband died, but instead of going back to her country, she married an Israelite. Instead of going back to her people, she decided to stay with Naomi, her husband's mother, and then she ends up moving back to Israel, and Boaz marries her. And Ruth's another important woman because she has a son who is the grandfather of David, and David is the line that Jesus comes from. So here we see the second woman mentioned in the lineage of Jesus. All right, the next books are 1st and 2nd Samuel. And they are the story of the prophet of Samuel and the time he was leading the people of Israel. And during this time, the people complained to God that they wanted a king. They didn't want a prophet or a judge to be in charge. They wanted a king to rule over the 12 tribes instead of what they saw as a judge or a prophet. But really, the whole time, God had been the leader of the Israel, and he warned them that no, you don't want a king. King are not perfect men, they're flawed, but when you make them a king, you give them all this extra power. And so God listened to them, and he gave them a theocracy. He gave them a monarchy, which is a nation ruled by a king, to replace the theocracy, which is a nation ruled by God or a religion. And 1 Samuel is all about Saul's reign. Saul was the first king of Israel. So first, God calls Samuel, and Israel asks for a king. God gives them Saul. He's the first king, but Saul doesn't follow God, and God rejects him. Then David, the next king, is anointed by Saul. David, of course, is the David from David and Goliath, and we all see the picture there. We know the story. And Saul gets jealous of David. He's very popular, and people know he's the next king. And Saul tries to kill David, but God is protecting him. And 2 Samuel is all about David's reign. It's the story of David becoming king. And once again, David is not the perfect king. And he does things that God doesn't want him to do. Such as David really wants to build a temple, but he wants to build it for himself to show what he could do. So God says, no, you're not going to build my temple. David also is known for committing adultery with Bathsheba, another man's wife, and David plots to have that man killed in battle, then takes Bathsheba. And then the prophet Nathan comes and talks to David, and David repents for his actions, and he's sorry for it. He lives a good life at the end. He's close to God, but he's not perfect. David's son does try to rebel against him and take over as king, and he is killed. And David does finally build an altar to God. Late in life, he repented everything he'd done wrong. He turned back to God, and God allowed him to build an altar to him. And then David's son, who was conceived through that affair, through the adultery with Bathsheba, was the next king. And 1st and 2nd Kings are all about the kings that come after David, beginning with Solomon. Solomon was David's son, and he becomes king. And when he's a boy, God says, you can ask for anything you want, Solomon. And Solomon asks God for wisdom, not for wealth or power or strength. He asks for wisdom. And because of that great request, God makes him wealthy. He makes him the most rich king in ancient history. He allows Solomon to build this beautiful temple. We see that he has many wives, and Sam at class told us that that was kind of ancient history talk for saying he was very, very rich. He was one of the richest people in the world. After he dies, the nation is split into two different kingdoms. The north will be called Israel, and the south is called Judah. And this is because after Solomon, there was never a great king, no one who could bring the nations together, and they were always disputing one another. So there are several other kings throughout the books, 1st and 2nd Kings, but Hezekiah and Josiah are the only good ones, the only ones that followed God and led the people well. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are actually a recap of Samuel and Kings. They kind of retell the history. The name means history. 1st Chronicles is all about David. 2nd Chronicles is all about Solomon and the kings that came after him. Kind of just another way of telling the history from the books of Kings. And in the end of the Chronicles, the Babylonians conquer the Israelites and destroy the temple. The Babylonians were an ancient nation. They were very powerful, and when Israel wasn't following God, God allowed them to be conquered by their enemies, just like we saw back in Judges. And the Babylonians conquered the Israelites, destroyed the temple, and they took all the people back with them to Babylon. They brought them all into exile. And so Ezra is the story of 70 years later. These people, the Israelites, have been in exile. They were in Babylon, and that's 900 miles away from their homeland. And so after 70 years, some of them get sent back to start rebuilding the temple. And then Ezra later on comes back with more people. But while they were constructing the temple, the people didn't fully rely on God. They weren't fully invested in the project. They weren't really doing what God wanted, and poor construction Poor hearts and construction meant it was a disappointing temple. It wasn't nearly as grand or fancy as the one before, the one that God had designed, so it wasn't the perfect temple. The next book is Nehemiah, and he's kind of around at the same time as Ezra. And Nehemiah is a guy who comes back to Jerusalem, and it's his job to build a wall. And so in 52 days he builds a wall all the way around Jerusalem. It's still standing today. And while this is happening, Ezra reads the Torah to the Israelites. And the temple is built, the wall is built, and they rediscover their history. They rediscover the Torah and how God was always with them, and the Israelites recommit to living for Yahweh, which is the name that God gave us back at the burning bush, and they recommit themselves to being His nation, to being His people, and to following Him. Esther is a story, and Sam told us that it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God. And it's kind of a history story about the nation of Israel being saved by this woman. And so the blanks there are beauty contest, and later, and then the bottom one is Haman wants to kill all the Jews. So I'm gonna kind of summarize this story really quick for you. So there is a king, and he wants to have a beauty contest. He wants his wife to compare herself to all these other people, and his wife Vashti says, I am not going to participate. And so the king says, fine, I'm going to get myself a new queen. I'm going to marry whoever wins this beauty contest. And he hears about this woman Esther, and Esther is a Jewish person living in this foreign land. But she's not supposed to compete because she's Jewish. So she secretly competes, and she wins. So she becomes queen. And then later on, there's another king in a different land, Haman, and he wants to kill all the Jews. And Esther's uncle Mordecai is living in this land that Haman is king. And Haman says, everybody has to bow down and worship me. But Mordecai says, no, I only worship God. And then so Haman says, instead of punishing Mordecai, he is going to kill all the Jewish people, the entire nation of Israel. But since Esther is queen of another nation, she gets her husband, the king, to interfere, and together, Esther, Mordecai, and this king that Esther is married to stop Haman from killing all the Jews, and they save the day. And they are still remembered to this day as having saved the nation of Israel from genocide, from being wiped out. So where do we see Jesus in these historical books? We see that the Israelites get distracted and they grow unfaithful very easily. They are constantly forgetting what God has done for them. But God never stops loving them and always keeps His promises. He preserves His people using judges and kings so that one day the King of Kings can be born to save and rule forever. Jesus is that King of Kings. He is the final leader that we need, the answer, the Savior, much better than these earthly kings and leaders that we learned about today. All right, we will see you on February 11th. Have a great day.